Okay, so last year, at the end of the year, I prepared an overview of the miniature projects I had finished in 2023, which was cathartic, and it really helped me appreciate the time I had spent. Just to reiterate a point I've made before, and I'll make again, miniature wargaming is fundamentally a crafting activity. Most of your time is spent making toy soldiers, and only a very small amount of it playing with toy soldiers, and even when you do, you're still playing with toy soldiers. If that's not your thing, miniature wargaming is not for you. But it is something I enjoy, so let's see what I managed in 2024. I try to break my projects up into little batches, doing 2 or 3 things every 2 months, so that I don't get bored, but I also link those together to make larger projects, and one of my big projects for 2024 was Blood and Crowns. Blood and Crowns is a skirmish level miniature war game covering the 100 Years' War. And I'm trying to set up a specific skirmish very briefly mentioned in Lebeca. I'm doing this in 1/72nd scale because a few years ago I got into 1/72nd scale. I would not recommend 1/72nd, which is an orphan scale. If you are interested in doing Blood and Crowns, 28mm is the scale to go for, or if you want to try something a bit different, 15. The first group of the year were crossbowmen. In reality, English armies used crossbows and French armies used longbows, but there was a tendency for each side to favour one of the weapons, and so for the first scenario I'm setting up longbows for the English, which I did in 2023, and crossbows for the French. The crossbows are still in the gritty style I gave the longbows, but they have a much more varied colour scheme which reflects the conventions of 15th century manuscripts. This batch included 38 figures from various manufacturers. As well as the crossbows themselves, I have loaders, some using foot straps, some using windlasses. If you're ever going to be producing miniatures, reloading posers should be a real focus for crossbows, because in war games they distinguish what type of crossbow is being used. Blood and Crowns has 2 different categories, light and heavy, and I want the option of distinguishing those in a unit. And the easy way to do that is to simply substitute 1 or 2 loaders into each unit to indicate. I also did a small group of handguns and a cannon. Gunpowder weapons were used throughout the 100 Years' War, and one of the most egregious failings in Blood and Crowns is the absence of rules for them. Finally, I did a set of pavassiers in the manner Blood and Crowns treats them, which is as a separate figure guarding the crossbowmen. I don't know if that's an accurate depiction. I also did a few crossbowmen reloading with their backs turned behind a pavis, which is how Zvezda treat that particular feature. The second batch, which in actual time was a good couple of months later, was various footmen and men-at-arms, and the leaders of the 2 forces. My colours here are driven by game practicality almost entirely. The idea is to give the footmen a very basic juxtaposed colour scheme, yellow and black, white and black, red, blue and white, for the city of Tournai, which is mentioned in connection with the skirmish that I'm working on, and the St. George Cross, which we know was used as an occasional uniform by English troops. That way, the footmen can be linked to particular knights with more elaborate colour schemes in the retinue that commands the force. The St. George troops are based a little differently on 18mm bases with a wood effect, because at some point I potentially want to do some naval actions, and that would be a better base for that than the grass base. Once I had most of the miniatures done, that's not all of them, I needed to turn my hand to scenery. Since I'm building a specific historical scenario, albeit with scant information, I need terrain, and the main centrepiece is a bastille, a temporary tower fortification commonly employed by besieging forces. I have no idea what this would have looked like. This one is loosely based on a 12th century reconstruction in Germany. I've made a bunch of alterations to accommodate war games. The levels are 40mm high to allow enough room for figures to stand, which is probably higher than they would have been, as it puts them just under 3 meters. And the stairs would never have looked like that, but they need to look like that in a war game in order to be able to stand figures on it. The tower here was 90% finished, and it was quite time consuming. Then I returned to some figures. The final batch got a few other items in it. This one was based on a coat of arms at Noel's house, which we visited in September. I added a full shield and the heraldic animal, a white leopard. The Noel's estate was there in the 100 Years' War, but the arms here are, I believe, those of the Sackville Wests, a 19th century ennoblement, so this one's a complete fiction. I'm thinking in future I might use some contemporary armorials to do my knights. And this is the last batch of figures. Technically, none of these are actually combatant figures. These are paired sets of banners for the French and English, same pose, paintwork, and even ground cover. The idea being that one substitutes for a figure in the unit, and the other one goes on the unit card to allow you to connect unit and figures together. There were some other bonuses in here, a couple of men to represent that the unit has axes, a couple of figures to represent vintners and veterans and other special characters. I need to take stock here. I'm not going to finish this project this year, but there will be a reason for that I'll explain later. But I decided late on in the year to take stock and work out what it was I was missing. First thing is a storage solution. I need some kind of box to put the figures in, and this is what I've been experimenting with, a sort of shelf-like box with magnetic tape so that the figures can just stand on that. This worked well, and it lies flat in the size of really useful box I've got, which is a 4 litre. I also need unit cards. At the moment, I've made banners to connect them to the units, so it'd be a pity not to finish those, but I need the actual cards for the banners to go on. I need some more terrain. The tower in the scenario I'm talking about needs to be defended by a double ditch. And finally, I need a table cover. That could be a simple cloth, but I think I'm going to get a battle map for this. Will I actually get this on the table? No idea. In many ways, as I said at the start, that isn't really the point. And this would not be the most elaborate project that I've ever managed to not get on the table. But if it does get on the table, it won't be this year. All those bits are for 2025. Talking of scenery, I was digging around in the loft and found some old stuff used for 28mm Sci-Fi from 30 years ago. This won't get on the table, I don't think. A lot of it went in the bin, but for some nostalgia reasons, I wanted to spend some time to redo one particular piece, which, as you can see, was looking pretty sorry for itself when I found it. I did an update in the process. Mantic's Deadzone, which I'll talk about later a bit later, is a slightly unusual miniature game in that it is played on a 3-inch grid. I've played a few times, and I have to say the 3-inch grid, which is 8x8, so 2 foot by 2 foot board, is pretty awkward. If there's any height, and skirmish games like that benefit from a lot of height, then the terrain makes it very difficult to reach the figures. I'd already messed a little with 4.5-inch cubes, so here on this scenery I superimposed 2 grids on the terrain, a 3-inch and a 4.5-inch. Superimposing 2 grids makes the patterns more complex and makes them look more natural, and it gives me the option of using it with a gridded system in the future. In the same box as that homemade stuff were 2 early GW corner wall sections, now the almost de facto form of 40k scenery. I transferred those onto a 9x9-inch plywood board and scratch built up around it a ruin and put a water effect in the middle. I wasn't 100% happy with the water effect, but it worked okay. Otherwise, sci-fi figures don't feature heavily this year. I did play a few games of Deadzone. I like Deadzone. It's clever and fast-playing and much less derivative than is the norm for Mantic games. On the con side, there is the usual proliferation of counters, and cube-based terrain has definite trade-offs. I use my Harlequins at the moment for games, and one of my old Dreadnoughts got a spruce up and rebase for a higher point value game. It's old enough that the basing convention was 40mm square bases. But I've also been thinking about using Space Marines. I'm old enough, the convention actively encouraged by GW at the time was for players to develop their own chapter colour schemes. No one was supposed to play Blood Angels or Ultramarines. And I think that's a big loss, though players, like many things that GW do, share much of the responsibility. Anyway, I've loads of Marines, but I was never really happy with the colour scheme, partly I suspect because I was attempting something beyond my skill level when I was 13. So I messed with some ideas for a revised version and got one miniature done. Still not completely happy, but I got as far as a revised concept sketch. I might even try to make up some sprues as the Deadzone Enforcer team, or I might dig around in the box for some Imperial Guard. Who knows? Talking of messing with concepts, last year I did a proof of concept set of Goblins with one of Mantic's more derivative games in mind, Kings of War. I had planned to look at some Elves, and that kind of sat on the shelf until May when I realised I just wasn't going to get motivated. So I came back to the Goblins and I got my basic Tiger Tank list done before I was halfway through the year, so let's talk about that. First up are the Toad Riders. At the moment, I have these arranged on movement trays for a regiment and a separate figure, the one on the frog, on a distinct base for a Goblin King. I also at this stage did a set of spiders as markers for more pups. I just want to make one point on this. There is no such thing as a miniature agnostic game. But there is also no reason you have to buy specific models from a specific company. Goblins on toads with bows are pretty much interchangeable with goblins with bows in wolf-drawn chariots on a stat line, and I tend to agree with a friend of mine that there's something quite meh and uninspiring about a lot of Mantic's own figures. Here, I particularly don't like the wolves. This is the list I'm working towards, with those 2 units ticked off. This is a Tiger Tank list. Tiger Tank lists are a pretty simple concept. In this case, this list is the lowest points for a Kings of War game, 745, but it is also the minimum number of units, 4, that you can have in a list of that size. The idea is you pick the most elite, highest points value force you can. In World War II terms, a Tiger Tank, in order to minimise the number of models and thus the modelling and painting time, and also, not relevant to me, but often important, the cost. With 2 units down and a little break, I returned to the Luggett gang. I'm using orcs to represent the Luggets as I don't have enough orcs to do an actual orc army. These were painted decades ago, and they're not awful given when I painted them. This sort of paint job looks fine on a battlefield if I'd simply gone back and, actually finished some of those bases. But they don't match the red, white, black scheme I've used so far on the Goblins. So I decided to just repaint them all, which also required some conversion work to add weapons. I think this orc was originally part of an artillery crew. I was quite happy with the final result, despite the figures being older Citadel, a mixture of GW and competitor plastics, and some metals which I think came from Grenadier and Ral Partha. They all hang together fairly well. My conversions to give some of the figures weapons blended in, and as you can see, I did not actually need very many. 7 figures fills out the movement tray. If I give them a more pup, 9 would do it without, but it tends to be much more efficient to paint in batches, and I had 21, so that's what got painted. This one was also a little bit of a learning experience because the figures didn't quite fit in the movement tray. They're 25mm square bases and they're representing troops the game expects to be on 20mm bases. I made a filler piece to help cover the base. Not strictly necessary, but I think it helped. Oh yeah, and this happened. There are various ways you can magnetize, and here I've chosen to use rare earth magnets on the figures to connect to steel on the bases, which creates a strong bond. Too strong to cut corners. I used Daz to fill the bases, but Daz is an air-drying, water-based modelling compound, and it shrinks, and when it does, it loses its connection with the base, and it just gets pulled out by the magnet. Next time, I'm going to be using Milliput. 3 down, 1 to go. The last thing to do, get this project finished, was a mincer mob. in this case consisting of 2 war machines cobbled together from parts from about half a dozen different kits, crewed by GW Snotlings. I always appreciated the comically cute line GW took with their smaller goblinoids. I didn't put intermediate bases on the models, so these are sitting directly on the metal surface. I filled the space in between with some orcs. I could probably get a Snotling pump wagon. They're available on the secondary market. Not cheap, but not outrageous either. And build a smaller unit to occupy the middle space. But for now, all of those spare orcs I painted earlier can make themselves useful. And yes, the models went back into a storage box and back up into the loft. I doubt these are going to hit the table anytime soon. Everybody I know who plays Kings of War does so at about 2,300 points, but it was nice to finish them, and I liked the end result. And the process of making lists and ticking them off and then recording for the diary episodes has turned out to be really good for my enthusiasm, enjoyment, and ultimately mental health. Which brings me to the subject of counting. I like counting things, and the orcs and spiders are pretty simple. Each of those is 1 figure. Cavalry, like the Toad and Frog Riders, seem reasonable to count as 2 infantry. But what about war machines? 2 seems a little small as a count, but 1 per crew seems too much. And if I wanted to count the figures I did for Blood and Crowns, how would I count the scenery? And should I adjust for the figures being 1/72nd? What about 15mm or 6mm? I didn't do any 15 this year, but I did do some 6mm. We'll see those in a moment. If you're the kind of person who likes counting up achievements and you've got a system, please let me know what you think in the comments. Let's talk about the distraction, the reason I did not get that Blood and Crowns project finished this year. Last year, someone at the club handed over all of their Steve Jackson Games miniatures for the game Ogre. I took them to subsequently distribute, depending on how I split the figures. I think there's 4 to 6 basic sets, but I know what that means in practice. Until I get some painted up and take them in for an actual game, no one is going to have any interest. And the way the club is now, that means I have to be able to accommodate 4 players. I painted up a set in 2023, but it was with a Mark 3B. I decided I wanted the conventional component to match the Ogre component, so I needed to paint 3 more points of armour, which is 6 light GEVs, painted up here as an independent Netherlands recon detachment. I got those done in about April, and I quite enjoyed painting the 6mm figures. Oh, if you're wondering, these are still just counters as they would be in the basic Ogre game, and I use NATO symbology. I count GEVs as cavalry to distinguish them from armour. And by mid-April, I had 2 sets ready. 1 Mark 3B in European colours and 1 Mark 3 in North American colours. Ogre's miniature range has 2 distinct styles of vehicles. I think they're called something like the Combine and the Pack Fed, and I decided that I would split them European forces in camouflage patterns and North American forces in more sci-fi flag patterns, in this case Canadian. These got on the table at the end of spring, and someone then suggested, why don't we take this to the Joy of 6 show, which was about 8 weeks away when they said it. And the problem with taking this stuff to a show is simple. Shows are not really about the figures. What elevates a show game is terrain. And so out of the window went the idea of doing a battle map with hexagons on it. With just 8 weeks, we needed to create interesting looking 3D terrain. We got to work with a 3D printer generating hex boards. And this was the first sample piece. And this looked okay. And there were bits here that didn't work. So, for example, I used plaster for the ground cover. It turns out that's way too brittle. I had to replace it with tiling grout. And then ultimately, once we'd worked out what to do, I had to get a production line going. Here are various boards in different states of preparation. They're using essentially the same format as my Battletech MDF boards from last year, but upscaled because here the hex is a 50mm. This kind of thing takes a lot of work, and it also requires a degree of acceptance. You never actually get everything ready. I was still working an hour before leaving for the show. You need to know which corners you can cut. But in the end, I got 2 acceptable tables done, and I think we had about a dozen players over the day. Some ad hoc reviewing. Brigade models 1 to 1000 scale buildings are awesome for this sort of thing, but you need a lot to represent even a modestly sized town. Over 100 models went onto the board for about 15 hexes. Scotia Grendel's 6mm models are okay. The vehicles are generally nice, but the casting isn't always brilliant. They got into a bundle for this for the show because they make an Ogre alike. And yes, in case anybody's wondering, I'm aware there's an Ogre miniatures game, but I won't be touching it with a barge pole. Final thought. Anything like this is kind of intense and draining, and while it was a lot of fun, it meant Ogre went into boxes and did not come back out in 2024. I needed a break. So if you enjoyed the tactical review in November, I'm really glad, but it will be a while before you see more content on this topic. However, as the summer drew to a close, I did find myself with a renewed enthusiasm for the Elves, which had sat on the shelf for the first 3 months of the year, and they came back down out of the loft. This is the Tiger Tank list I worked up for them, and it's very, very different. This is a very different project to the Goblins. Whereas with the Goblins, I have all sorts of different figures, and what I painted was only about a third of what I actually have. Almost everything here comes from just 4 poses of very early Citadel plastics. I have 23 spearmen in 1 pose, and 49 archers in 2 poses, and I have 11 Dark Elf crossbow, which I established after a quick test I could convert into spearmen. That allows me to create 3, with the handful of character models I've got, almost identical units, which consist of a 1-to-1 ratio of missile troops and melee troops. It means batch painting. Batch painting 100 models. Now, batch painting unimposed models can feel like a chore, and you need to be in the right mindset. That's why I also decided to splash a bit of money and give myself a reward. I bought a unicorn and a figure from Reaper Miniatures. Reaper do nice fantasy models. Now, to be fair, these 2 probably cost more than all of those plastics put together as a result of inflation, but it gives me a nice character model to paint at the end once I've finished with all the batch painting. I also decided to do some experimentation on this group, that it would be a blending practice. Here are the figures part way through that blending process on their shield, with some problems. Third from the left, in the detail, that's a tide mark that's resulted from my being heavy-handed with a glaze. Blending is absolutely not a technique you need to do on tabletop figures. It's quite rare to see it outside of the painting crowd, who are doing it almost entirely for display models. But it's a useful technique, and like anything, it's a matter of patience and practice, and I can't think of a way of getting more practice, including in fixing problems, than batch painting close to 100 models. Opinions on whether or not blending is worth it vary, but I'll refer you to better painters than myself for that. Oh, and also, I wanted to do some experimentation with the gold, so here's the final product. Why don't you use non-metal metals? After all, that's one of the main uses of blending, and I'm already doing a blending practice. The problem with non-metal metals is they don't look good on the tabletop. If I move the camera around the figures, you can see how the light changes as the point of view shifts. That is how your eye expects metallic finishes to behave, but it's not how non-metal metals behave. So you immediately create an uncanny valley effect, which breaks the illusion if you're moving relative to the figures, which you will be with tabletop figures, and obviously wouldn't be with photographed display figures. Which is not to say that non-metal metals aren't a great technique for display painting, just that it doesn't work well in this context. This was actually the very last thing I finished in December, and they went into a box because, remember, this is only 1/4 of the figures for the units. It's not actually a complete unit, despite how I have it racked up on screen. I did get one thing done almost alongside this, overlapping with those elves, and that was I created a stand for a Christmas village set. These are 5 porcelain houses intended for you to string a set of lights through, but the lights with them didn't work, so they needed a base in order for me to be able to wire in a bunch of LEDs so that they can go on top of those. Not perfect results, but it turned out pretty well for a weekend's work just before Christmas. Yeah, that was more scenery, wasn't it? It was a scenery-heavy year. I made this too for the game Eisenhower. Eisenhower is a game by Sam Mustafa, a follow-up and reworking of his previous World War II game Rommel. I played 2 games in November and I enjoyed it as a game. As a war game, i.e. something with an element of simulation, it's actually pretty bad. But as a game, it's got a lot of clever touches. And it gave me a chance to dig out my old 15mm Flames of War figures. I mentioned this before, no miniatures game is truly miniatures agnostic. The term is more of a marketing jargon than an actual feature of games. But games like Eisenhower, which use a grid, 6-inch squares with a stacking limit of 3 units, are much more forgiving than free-form games, and the Flames of War forces were readily adapted. The problem, and I realise there are 3 grid games in this year's review, is they are way more intensive in terms of making terrain than free-form. In this case, I needed to put a 6-inch square on a cloth. Fortunately, I had a sufficiently desert-like fabric, an airbrush, and the skills to do that in a day. But in case the whole episode so far isn't enough of a clue, I've done this before. And with grids, you can't just slap a hill or a dune down. You need to build terrain to match the grid. All of which I know when I started out would have been incredibly daunting and very time-consuming, which is why I think in the past grids have not been very popular. They may make the game work easier, but they make the terrain much harder. Anyway, you might see some content about Eisenhower next year. I'm hoping to do some historical scenarios. And that's it, the end of the year, and it's good to look back and see I was actually quite productive. The tick list only just fits on a slide. Also, I don't think I would have realised how terrain heavy the year was if I had not been keeping a diary. If you've got any thoughts on how I can quantify that productivity, given the problem of counting disparate things, drop them in the comments. Oh, and if you're wondering why the schedule has dropped off, I got a new job in May and I've had less time to prep episodes, so I'll be making less content. I still will be making content, but I suspect every 2 months rather than the once a month I was previously aiming for. So, as these episodes traditionally end, here endeth the lesson.